Good afternoon. There's an expression, there's an English expression that's wrongly attributed to the Chinese. It says, "May you live in interesting times." Now, interesting times means chaos, anarchy, disruption, and this seems to be what we are living through right now. Let me give you a quick uptake on where we are in 2022. Our trade with China is at one of the highest levels it's been, over $100 billion last year. It's one of the highest ever. Simultaneously, we're looking at one of the largest deployments of troops at super high altitudes in Ladakh. And that deployment has entered its third year. We're looking at something like 50 to 60,000 Indian and Chinese soldiers facing off. We're truly living in interesting times, as that saying says. And joining me to make sense of these times that we live in, make sense of that dragon in the room, as we say, is a very distinguished panel. Some of the biggest names in the defense and security analysis business. And I want to start with my first question to Ambassador Sujan R Chinoy. So do you feel that the specter of conflict between India and China hangs like a Damocles sword on our planners, our political and military establishment? And what do you see are the consequences of this fear that's there, this dragon in the room? It has many manifestations. Do you see that as a big issue weighing heavy on the minds of our thinkers and planners?
The specter of conflict that you mentioned is not a new development. The Westphalian notion of nation states came about between India and China as a result of the two countries coming into being in 1947 and 1949, at which point of time the notion of loosely defined frontiers gave way very quickly to an urgent need to identify your national identity and your geographical borders. And we have been through, in the last 7 decades or more, through several cycles of tension and conflict, each different in its own way. If you look at 1962, we had a hiatus of 14 years before we picked up from where we had left off and re-established relations at the ambassadorial level. If we look at 1998, when we had our nuclear tests, when the bottom had fallen off in our relationship, that negative cycle lasted for 2 years before President K.R. Narayanan visited China in May of 2000 and relations picked up again. And Doklam, as you know, lasted 73 days. A week later, after the resolution of that issue, you had Prime Minister in Xiamen attending the BRICS sort of event. So we are in a situation where we need to manage this complex relationship because of the outstanding boundary issue, because of the manner in which China has spilled over into our region. Its capacities are well known. We can identify clearly the number of ships it has, the number of planes it has, but its intentions have always been very opaque. And the non-transparency in its build-up in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific theater, now in the Indo-Pacific theater, more specifically in South Asia, where it actually impinges on our interests, that is the core of the issue. So this is a relationship which requires management because of the tendency to have cyclical conflict and release of tension. This time around, the situation is far more serious, and it requires much greater attention. The positive side is that dialogue has not been interrupted at any stage, and we have seen that notwithstanding the economic sort of response that we gave to their aggression in eastern Ladakh, we have seen that trade has picked up. And that is the nature of a globalized economy. Decoupling is a chimera. You cannot decouple in a year or two. So it's a complex relationship, and the specter of tensions will always remain in this relationship, which has elements of cooperation and competition inherently built into the relationship. This will remain so. It requires management, and management also means on equal terms. And for India, it means enhancing our economic strength, improving our sort of infrastructure, having better management of our own region, so that our response to the region in terms of the Chinese expansion of its presence, it's not just in security terms, but also has a very, very significant economic element to it.
It's a very complex relationship. Now, while we talk about India and China and the dragon in the room, there's another aspect to that relationship with India and China, that is Pakistan. Now, the fact is that Pakistan and China have been allies for over half a century. Ambassador Bambawale, you've been envoy to both Islamabad and Beijing. There's an expression that the military uses for this. They call it the two-front security challenge. Do you see this as having increased in the last few years, this two-front dilemma posed by a China-Pakistan axis? Or do you see that as being more of a chimera?
Thank you for that question. I hope all of you can hear me. Sandeep, the fact is that today there is a very strong nexus between China and Pakistan. The two-front situation is a reality. And all of us, the army and the armed forces, are already preparing and ready for it. And all of us as ordinary Indians should mentally at least also prepare for it, because it's a reality on the ground. It's no chimera.
And how do you see this as having been accelerated in the last couple of years? I mean, and where do you see that going in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think it's been accelerated since 2013, when the Chinese started doing the China-Pakistan economic corridor. There's no other country or no other company from any other country which is investing in Pakistan. The only people who are investing in Pakistan are the Chinese. So that's the importance. At one stage, the Pakistanis used to describe the China-Pakistan economic corridor as a game changer. Also, I'd like to point out that the very close relationship between China on the one hand and Pakistan on the other is due to the strong linkages between the People's Liberation Army of China and the Pakistan Army or the Pakistan military. As long as that strong linkage continues, and as long as the Pakistan Army, Pakistan military continues to call the shots and in a sense govern Pakistan, this nexus is a reality. It's going to grow stronger over the years.
Ajit, I want to bring you in on this aspect of the India-China relationship. What Ambassador Chinoy mentioned, that we need to manage the relationship. There is this dichotomy of being, China having one of the largest, bilateral trade numbers with India. And at the same time, they're your number one security challenge as well. So it wouldn't be very surprising for an army officer posted in eastern Ladakh to look at the Chinese tanks over there and wonder whether the ore that made those tanks, whether the steel that made the tanks was made from ore that was shipped from India. How do you reconcile to this, the fact that your number one trading partner is also your number one security challenge?
Sandeep, the Chinese growth story is nothing short of a miracle. The spectacular growth that they had since 1978, or at least since the early 1980s, all the way to 2010 and now. And we know that this growth story was, the engine of growth was exports. Exporting to the West, exporting to USA, exporting to Europe, Japan. In 2001, India was destination number 19 in the pecking order of export importance to China. By 2015, we were number 6 and heading towards number 5. That's how important exports from China to India were to their economy. And this bilateral relationship, at least the trade relationship, was perhaps one of the most dynamic in the world, growing at more than 20% per annum consistently for 15 to 18 years. As Ambassador Chinoy said, in 2020, we had the Ladakh incident. We can talk about it later. In 2020, despite Ladakh, India's biggest trading partner was China. And then we had imposed some sanctions. In fact, before Ladakh in March, we had imposed restrictions on FDI coming into India from China. So in 2021 calendar year, what happens? The number one trading partner is still China, and it's 20% more. So you see this relationship, the economic and trade and commerce relationship, including investment relationship, is pretty dynamic. It must be mutually beneficial. Of course, it's asymmetric, and that's a matter of concern that the trade is growing, but it's growing asymmetrically. China represents something like $6 to $7 trillion of a consumer economy. Forget about the size of GDP. This is the second largest consumer economy in the world. Surely Indian exporters in their quest for growth, in fact, exports are a very big part of India's growth strategy. Surely we can't afford to ignore that. So I think the reality is that this India-China, as Ambassador Chinoy said, that in this world of globalization, interlinkages, trade relationships, we have to, personally I think, we have to contend with the fact that prior to Ladakh or even prior to Doklam, we were able to pursue a relationship where we were able to compartmentalize the trade, the border dispute, That's going to take its own time. That has its own mechanism. There was a mechanism to, in fact, de-escalate tensions. There was eyeball-to-eyeball hostility, but thankfully there were no casualties, at least until Ladakh. So we were able to pursue that, but at the same time, we were pursuing strong trade linkages. So I think, perhaps we need to explore whether that can. I know that Ladakh has changed the status quo. The actions of China were unilateral. They were, they are the ones who started the change of status quo. Before that, Doklam. So the onus is on them to, to kind of initiate the the withdrawal or going back to the earlier status. But we cannot, I think, personally, I think the trade relationship and this border dispute will coexist.
Trade relationship and the border dispute will coexist. And while we were talking about relationships between India and China, Pakistan and India, I want to bring in Zorawar by asking him this very important aspect of India's number one strategic partner, that's Russia, currently involved in a war in Europe, the Russia-Ukraine war. What are the security challenges, what are the dilemmas that this war presents to New Delhi?
Yeah, so this confrontation we're seeing between the United States, NATO, and Russia isn't actually new. It's been building up since at least 2014. One of the factors that we from India see the United States is, despite seeing a rising China in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, it has chosen to primarily focus its strategic attention, its military confrontation with Russia, which they claim is not a threat to them in the future. So it's slightly illogical and irrational what they've been doing. For us, of course, Russia plays a central role to our military modernization, strategic autonomy, and a whole range of issues which the insiders will tell you. I think now the challenge is the US response to Russia's intervention in Ukraine is creating a whole lot of realignments on the global stage. You're seeing a closer relationship between China and Russia. You're seeing, in fact, it's ironically, Xi Jinping on his birthday, June 15th, calls up Putin to sort of project this strong partnership with Russia. Why is he doing it? He's sending a message to the Americans that don't think that you can contain us the way you're trying to do them. So I think the response for India should be that we can't let Russia be isolated by the West. I think that would be a flawed policy. I know there are few in our establishment or maybe in the commentariat who have suggested that Russia is a bad bet for India. I don't see it that way. I think to lose Russia, to see Russia weakened, will leave the playing field for China even stronger. And you're going to see ultimately then a G2 emerge, which is the United States and China. And as we've seen in the past, when these two superpowers get together, even in an uncertain relationship, I think India and many other regional powers will lose out. So if we want multipolarity, we need to ensure that along with the United States, Russia is cultivated and maintained stronger. But I would also sort of, as an corollary to this, if we're seeing the major powers compete, and this competition is going to be a feature for the next maybe decades, if not certainly for the 2020s, I think it provides us an opportunity on two fronts. One is the relationship with China, as was suggested, it can be stabilized and managed. If their attention is going to be on their eastern seaboard with the US allies on their periphery, I think India has this moment of opportunity for this 10 years to focus on internal modernization, growth, building up its comprehensive national strength, it's been called. Because the last thing we want from India is to be caught up in somebody else's great game. And I think in the past, we've shown that we have been able to carve out our national interests, pursue our security policies, without being part of a bigger game. And I think that's something which Indian policymakers, even in recent months, have shown a sense of prudence, a sense of long-term calculations, to not get swayed away by this belief that we must choose the right side of history, so to speak.
A great game and a 10-year window is what you're suggesting. Ambassador Chinoy, there's a conventional wisdom in the Indian strategic community that says that to offset the pressure on our land frontiers, India must move into the Indian Ocean, where it has some natural advantages over China. Do you believe that still is the case in 2022?
Thank you, Sandeep. Before I come to that point, let me make a quick remark about what Ajit said. He made some very relevant points. But to posit that as coexistence of the boundary question and trade being normal, that is an appropriate phrase. In other words, that there is ample space for the coexistence of an unresolved boundary question and normal trade relations. But there is absolutely no scope for the coexistence of bloodshed and a normal trading relationship. So when I talk to the Chinese, for instance, I make it very clear to them that we can continue to discuss the boundary question. It has remained unresolved. That was the old consensus that we reached during the Rajiv Gandhi visit. But we cannot pretend to have normal relations, including normal trading ties, if there is bloodshed. Bloodshed is what I cannot normalize in our bilateral relations. I do concede the point that we can normalize the existence of an unresolved problem that we can discuss and resolve peacefully. Having said that, let me turn quickly to your question about whether or not India can offset the tensions in Eastern Ladakh by expanding its presence in the Indian Ocean. Regardless of what happens in Eastern Ladakh, India has a geography that places it at a certain advantage in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is, in terms of spheres, in terms of concentric circles, the first concentric circle in which a large peninsular country like India must operate. There is a certain fade out to that same naval advantage as you get to the South China Sea and further afar to the Pacific. So yes, in the Indian Ocean, India must continue to be of primacy in terms of its naval deployments. And considering that we have a very, very good Navy, the naval budget has been growing. We have about 130 combatant vessels. We are well placed there to work on our own as well as in tandem with our critical partners. And our position today in the Indian Ocean is slightly different from what it was in the 1970s when India opposed the presence of great powers. Today, India is in fact welcoming of its strategic partners in the Indian Ocean. And we must do more. But at the same time, I would suggest that you do not bank on the proposition that greater cooperation at sea with strategic partners automatically results in commensurate benefits in terms of your landward deployment vis-a-vis China in Eastern Ladakh.
Strategic partners that you mentioned, very interesting. That was going to be my next question to Ambassador Bambawale. The fact that the strategic partnerships that we've gone into in the last couple of years, the dialogue of democracies, the Quad. Do you see formations, groupings like the Quad being able to offset Chinese pressure on us vis-a-vis the boundary dispute? What's India doing in formations like the Quad?
So let me start by saying that I agree that in a medium term, we need to work on Russia to see if, because we have a very close defense partnership with them. A lot of our defense equipment continues to come and sourced from Russia. So in a, say, 8 to 10 year period, we must continue to work on Russia to see if we can get it away from, you know, the clutches of China, to use a very bald frame word. As far as the longer term is concerned, you know, geopolitics today is characterized by one big development, and that is competition between China on the one hand, which is the rising power, and the United States on the other, which is the existing superpower. And unfortunately, the way I see things developing is that this is going to morph into a competition between an authoritarian system of the world, of ruling the world, of governing the world, of international politics, against a more open, transparent, rules-based order. And where that is concerned, I have very little doubt that given our values of being an open society, of being an open economy, of being a democracy, I have no doubt that India will come down on the side of the democratic, open, rules-based order. So that's my point of view. I can see India getting closer over the coming years, and even in the longer run, 25 to 30 years, getting closer to the great democracies of the world, by which I don't only mean the United States. I also mean countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, perhaps Indonesia, apart from France, Germany, UK, etc.
Do you see any of these democracies coming to our assistance, either militarily or diplomatically, in event of a border conflict with
you know,
China?
that
is
is
there an expectation?
Yeah, that's very simple to answer, Sandeep. They're not going to send troops. So if you expect some white faces to come on the India-China border, that's not going to happen. We've got to fight our own battle. Right. But where they will help us will be diplomatically. They will also help us in selling the best, you know, equipment, armed forces equipment, of course, for which we will have to pay good dollars. So they will do that for us, but we will have to fight our own battle on the China front, which I believe we have done so well, quite well so far. But I know that the Chinese are also preparing for something more in the coming years. So I'll stop there.
Fascinating points there. And, you know, Ajit, I want to bring you in on what Zorawar mentioned earlier. The fact that this close Beijing-Moscow relationship that's only increasing as the months go by, and the war in Ukraine is already 100 days old, and China is completely supportive of Russia there, whereas we have kind of taken a more neutral stance. Do you see Russia, you know, entering China's economic orbit and being unable to break out of that? You know, Russia as a global pariah now, being unable to break out of Beijing's axis. And what is it that India can do to offset that? This is the point that Zorawar made a little earlier.
So, Sandeep, the China-Russia energy deal was actually signed about, I think, three years ago, and it's a 40-year treaty of assured gas supply. So it's not as if the Russia-China nexus has begun just now after Ukraine. That's the first point. The second point, as Zorawar mentioned, the crisis in Ukraine, if you read the other side, I mean, not enough publicity comes to at least countries like India from the other side, the non-English speaking side, goes back to actually, I would say, 2008, Zorawar, not even 2014. And even the likes of Kissinger and Mearsheimer's have actually flagged this. So it's not as if it was unexpected, but maybe the intensity was unexpected. So that's another point to note. And the third point is that there is a theory that some of the world, perhaps including India, have some investment in the fact that Russia should not be completely, quote unquote, you know, geopolitically annihilated, or the space should be completely shrunk, because that a bigger space or a bigger weight for Russia, geopolitically speaking, gives us more options in terms of our own opportunistic alliances. I mean, I can understand Ambassador Bambawale's point that when it comes down to choosing the side of totalitarianism versus open societies, there is no doubt about it, absolutely not. But I don't think the binaries are that, I mean, it won't I don't think ever it'll come to such a stark binary. And given the trade relationship, if I may just put in another plug-in for this, we take pride in our telecom revolution. We are invested in a digital India future, where actually the spread of telecom, spread of telephony, but that has been riding on the base of cheap telephone instruments. And I mean, bulk of it has come from Chinese imports. Not just India, the Western world has benefited from Chinese export of Chinese disinflation. So really, this linkage is very, very complex. Even in the height of President Trump's sort of saber rattling with China, China-USA trade was $650 or $700 billion at the height of the tariffs. So that's, even there the economic linkage is pretty tight. So I think, coming back to this Russia point, is that there is some investment in fact that the Russians should have a bigger space, geopolitically speaking. So I'm just speaking as an economist, but this is a deeper question. And these binaries will never be as stark as, having to choose this side or that side.
Zorawar, we are in the 60th anniversary of the India-China war. And a few decades ago, there was an Indian defense minister who very famously said that China is our, enemy number one. Now, post the incidents in eastern Ladakh, there's been a growing realization in the Indian politico-military establishment that this is indeed the case, that China is our immediate security threat. What do you think New Delhi should be doing in the next couple of years to offset this huge disparity between the two countries, militarily, economically? What do you think needs to be done?
So I think first we have to properly frame the China challenge. It comes on many dimensions, right? So one is a consequence of having an unresolved border dispute. As you know, we haven't solved our frontiers with China. We've had opportunities in the past. We let them go. I don't know when the next one will come, but I believe that both the Indian and Chinese leaderships internally believe that as the status quo lies today, more or less, is how the frontiers will be settled. There will be hard bargaining for the last mile, so to speak, or the last sort of tactical points, but I think the essence of the India-China boundary is more or less frozen today. So if that is so, then the challenge we're speaking of is a geopolitical challenge. It's a challenge to India's aspirations to lead the region, India's relationships with its neighbors. Does China threaten to displace there? What kind of actual leadership aspiration does China have in South Asia? I think some of these questions are still in play. We don't really know for certainty, but we do know that the Chinese have engaged in a balance of power strategy with Pakistan to keep India somewhat confined to the subcontinent. Now, how do you break out of that? One is, of course, through building up your internal power potential across different metrics, starting from reforming your universities to your manufacturing ecosystem. I mean, the whole range of problems we have which have nothing to do with China. So why are we not going and pursuing those? Some of it is happening, but I think until you resolve those fundamental structural problems of economic transformation, you're not going to be able to compete. The second aspect is externally, what kind of balance of power strategy can we pursue, which allows us to also maintain our strategic autonomy, our independence, because the last thing you want is to engage in a balance of power strategy where you lose your freedom in the process, right? Because that would be just absurd. And then you're just going to be running around like you were during the British-Indian phase, where Indian troops are used for purposes that are not Indian national interests. So I think we have to be very careful. We pursue a balance of power strategy with the superpowers, with the great powers, United States, Russia. I don't consider realistically many of the other players in Western Europe and East Asia as independent great powers. They have been subordinated by the United States. So let's be clear-eyed. It's a hard-nosed business. Who you can actually ally with as an equal and who are part of an alliance system. I think these are clearly defined factors and values and commitments that come into place. So I think as far as I see it, the United States, Russia, China, these are the three great powers. India is the fourth one in line. And I think if we build up ourselves for the next 10 years, we are a strong contender to be that fourth pillar in this multipolar world. There'll of course be other civilizations. There'll be the Iranian civilization, there'll be the Vietnamese, the Indonesians, many in the Middle East, in South America. But the fourth player as potentially is going to be India. And if it is going to be India, I think most of the cards are to be played at home in terms of governance, modernization, transformation. I don't think China can limit us in that. I think what we should be doing is, during this period, leveraging all these major relationships, keeping them in some sort of balance and equilibrium, and maximizing advantage. So if I may slightly offer a discordant note with this idea of freedom and liberty on one side and this autocracy on the other, I think history has shown that the so-called democracies look at you through a hard-nosed lens. Have you ever been offered a democracy discount? If anything, in the Ukraine crisis, we were asked to pay a democracy premium to not buy Russian oil and suffer and face inflation the way Western Europe and the United States are doing. So I think our partners in the West are hard-nosed. They don't even lie about it. They're open. They're pursuing their interests. So if I may slightly add another layer to the India-China relationship, this idea of civilizational resurgence that we're seeing in a post-unipolar world. I think for the last 2-3 decades, until very recently, all these rising powers, that is India, China, had kind of let the US-led order shape how they would pursue their modernization, their growth, even their identities. I think now what we're seeing is, as that framework is no longer reliable, this new liberal economic framework, this idea that nationalism doesn't matter, I think all these things are now coming back. And if we are going to pursue civilizational resurgence, does the West accept you as that? Does it accept a civilizational India, or is it seeking a different type of India? I think we have to be very careful, because if we are wanting to be a civilizational India on our own terms and understanding our past and how it's playing out in the present and come to some sort of peace with our national identity, I think in that situation, all the more a stronger case could be made for having a more sophisticated relationship with the non-Western world. Let's put it that way. And that non-Western world does not go into these binaries, but they're complex. Vietnam is complex. Indonesia is complex. Iran is complex. If we start pursuing it through those lenses, we're going to deny Myanmar, for example. We're just having a summit next door with our eastern neighbors, and Myanmar foreign minister is not present in that, despite sharing a 1,600-kilometer border with India. Now, how do you connect with East Asia or Southeast Asia without Myanmar? Maybe we are buying into this binary, and we need to be a little more flexible, a little more realistic, and accept different political systems, as long as they're not impinging on our domestic realm. So,
yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, there's like a dozen hashtags in what you just said. But the point is well made. The fact is that India has to be a civilizational power, and we are fourth in line. As you said. And I want to bring in Ambassador Bambawale very quickly. So this point that Zorawar mentioned, the fact is that we are firewalled in South Asia. He seemed to suggest that unless we break out of the boundary dispute, there doesn't seem to be possibility of us breaking out and becoming a great power. Do you see that as the case, or would we be able to compartmentalize the dispute, the boundary dispute with China?
Look, let me put my views on this subject. One is, I don't think this is the time, or that to use a Chinese phrase, I don't think the time is ripe for India to settle the India-China boundary. The fact is that there is such a huge asymmetry between Chinese power and Indian power today that it will not be to our benefit to settle the boundary today. So I would say, and I would recommend to the government, if they ask me, is to play on this game and settle at a time in the future when the asymmetry between India and China is less. So that's my answer to the boundary question. Point number 2 is the reason why Eastern Ladakh has taken place is because the Chinese decided that they will no longer negotiate or talk to India on the boundary. They will use force to settle the boundary. So they have, decided for us what kind of relationship will follow in the coming years between India and China. So trying to manage the relationship, etc., is good. I don't disagree with that. And we do need to keep channels of communication open. But I think we should see the writing on the wall. The way India can tackle the China challenge is twofold. One is in the long term, and I agree with Zorawar there, though I disagree on many other things with him, is economic growth, economic growth, economic growth. We have to grow at 7, 8, 9, 10% GDP growth over the next 25 years. Then only will the asymmetry between India and China decrease. But in the long run, we're all dead. So what does India do in the short term? And in the short term, it is exactly what I stated earlier. India has to balance Chinese power by building our strategic partnerships with the great democracies of the world. And I repeat my point earlier that we should balance Chinese power by having a much stronger partnership with the United States, a much stronger partnership with Japan, a much stronger partnership with Indonesia, South Korea, etc. I'll stop there.
We've spoken about economics, geoeconomics, geopolitics. I want to bring in Ambassador Chinoy to talk about demography. Now, China's population is aging, and they say by 2050, the Chinese average median age is going to be something like 48 years, whereas India is going to be only in its 37 or 38. How does demography play a role in the India-China relationship? Do you see an aging China in the not-so-distant future continuing to be a threat to India?
I think personally the demographic part is slightly overrated because while it's true that China has an aging society, though not quite as aging as Japan has, and this is a fact recognized by Chinese social scientists, the fact remains that China is also making quick adjustments. So if you recognize the fact that in 1979 they had a one-child policy, it's equally true that post-2016, they have lifted those curbs and in fact are now encouraging families to have more than one child, more than two children, in fact, in some instances. So they've truly recognized that they are running out of an employable perennial source of young people to power their economy, to power the low-cost, high-volume manufacturing, and now, of course, the value-added, technologically high-end economy that they're trying to create. So they need that, and they're making the necessary adjustments. So let's not go too far with the demographic part, because on our side, we have to make use of what we have, and we have to skill them appropriately. So I think I'll leave that point there, but I want to quickly make 3 additional points, because there have been several references to external balancing, G2, working with the Quad to see if we can offset any asymmetrical situation in Eastern Ladakh. So on that point first. I think it was you who called me one day and said you had read an occasional paper that I had written on, it was titled The Cartographic Route to Strategic Partnerships. And I had been rather keen to point out that despite the fact that we have such close relations with the United States, Australia, and Japan, we must keep in mind that as far as Aksai Chin is concerned, while the United States maintains a position of neutrality regarding that as disputed territory, both Australia and Japan, and by the way, I've served in all the Quad countries, so I personally am extremely committed to these countries and the relationship. The fact of the matter is that Australia and Japan show Aksai Chin as a part of China. Of course, it's a fact that all 3 of them show Arunachal Pradesh as a part of India, but that's a separate issue. How on earth can you expect the Quad countries, even militarily, to come to your aid and assistance in Aksai Chin, as in Eastern Ladakh? That's the term I use. If Australia and Japan on their maps have yet to correct the cartographic part of our strategic relationship. So let us all remind our closest friends from time to time, as I do, that please bring yourself up to speed on that issue. Very quickly, China operates, ironically, on the twin principles of containment and encirclement itself, historically, and also the notion of spheres of influence. Precisely the points that it criticizes in terms of the policies of others. Now, I want to remind you that during the tenure of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, China had already been declared to be part of the Big Four. as early as the late 30s. China had been declared by the United States, no less, to be part of the council, as in the trusteeship of the powerful, as it was called. Later, by 1942, 1943, it was called the four, policemen, the big four. So at various points of inflection, I have noticed that China's rise has been facilitated by none other than the United States of America. Not just in the late 30s, not just in 1945 when China, got a permanent seat.
Post 71.
And post 71 when the PRC came in, or post 78 when US investments poured in, or during the Reagan era when military technologies were transferred. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And that is something that is of great and intriguing interest to me. From time to time, they also realize the folly of their policies. As you know, that book about the China fantasy, when India has never required a book like that. We have always been very clear about what China is about and how it relates to us. But the Americans, despite their enormous capacities, well-intentioned too, but have somehow not been able to read China correctly.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, gentlemen, for this fascinating insight into the dragon in the room. I'm sure all of you are going to take back with you a better appreciation and understanding of the contours of that dragon in the room. In geopolitics, nothing is what it seems, and the issues are far more complex than what they actually are. And thanks to our 4 high-powered experts here on this panel to help us decipher that. Thank you very much, gentlemen.